Hello, welcome to Liberty Wolf. My name is Zach Strong. This is the 8th edition of this podcast. Welcome. Today, I will be using my free speech to talk about free speech. Free speech has been a very hot button issue as of late. Most of you are likely aware that Alex Jones of InfoWars was recently suspended permanently from Facebook. Other social media platforms are also combining to silence InfoWars, to silence Alex Jones. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not you like Alex Jones. That's wholly irrelevant. The only important aspect of this story is whether or not Alex Jones and InfoWars were using their freedom of speech legitimately, or if they were using it to incite violence or call for aggressive acts against an individual or an establishment, or if they were spreading lies knowingly. See, free speech doesn't mean that you can say whatever you want to. For example, you can't incite a revolution, directly call for an armed revolt to overthrow the government that was established by the voice of the people. That's not your right. We have laws against slander and libel. There are public indecency laws that also apply. Here's the thing. Alex Jones has not been accused of any of those. The only thing Alex Jones and InfoWars are guilty of are saying things that the establishment does not want to hear. Saying things that people with power don't want said. Now, I don't always agree with Alex Jones. In fact, over the years, the more I've listened to him, the more I've kind of diverged from his point of view on a number of issues. I still agree with him probably the majority of the time. But see, that's not the issue. It doesn't matter whether I hated him and whether I disagreed 100% of the time. It doesn't matter if I think he's a conspiracy theorist or if I agree with the conspiracy facts that he presents. That's completely, totally irrelevant. The only thing at issue here is the right of free speech as guaranteed by the First Amendment. As I just noted, Alex Jones and InfoWars have not been accused of doing those things that I mentioned as being off limits, namely inciting revolution, inciting hatred and violence against a specific person. For example, calling for a mob to go to this person's house and burn it down. That would not be legitimate. Calling for an assassination of a president, as many insane people across the country are doing right now. That is not legitimate. There was a time in this country when that was actually taken seriously, and these people would be hauled in to prison, to the jail, and interviewed by Secret Service and others to find out if this was a legitimate threat or not. Today, however, you can just get up on the stage, if you're a comedian, and hold up a fake severed head of the president. Call for his assassination. It doesn't matter these days. Anything goes. That is, anything that is pro-establishment. There's a massive assault going on right now against free speech. That is, the freedom of speech of traditionalist Americans. I don't like the term conservative. I prefer constitutionalist or Jeffersonian. However, conservative fits for these purposes here. The number one enemy of the establishment are white, male, Christian conservatives. If you are white, and if you are a male, if you're a Christian, you're conservative, and you live right here in the United States, you are public enemy number one to this global conspiracy of psychopaths who want to snuff out our freedom. Your speech is under attack if you belong to that group. Even if you belong to a different group, and you criticize the establishment, you're going to be hammered for it. That's what it really comes down to. People in power don't want they don't want the peasants revolting. They don't want us to grab our pitchforks. They don't want us to speak out. And again, back to Alex Jones for just a moment. His case illustrates a principle. We see many, many people cheering, hooray, hooray, Facebook banned him, death to the ogre, those sorts of just crude things. But again, that's irrelevant what people think of him. Do you think they've ever stopped to think what type of a precedent they're setting? If Alex Jones, a nationally known radio host, can be permanently shut down, what about me? What about you? What about a friend of yours who has a Facebook page where he says controversial things? Are we protected at all? Who's going to protect us if we don't stand up and protect other people when their free speech is being infringed upon? Thomas Paine made a fairly famous statement. He said, quote, "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression. For if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself." Close quote. This precedent will reach right back to these same people. Guaranteed. Yours truly has already come under attack over the last couple of years for his points of view. To clarify, I'm talking about myself. I operate two websites, 7 Facebook pages, Facebook group. I published 2 books, and I just completed a third, which will be coming out hopefully by the end of this month. In the course of managing these various pages, I've faced a lot of opposition. I've had a lot of erroneous, false accusations against me. Some of these have led to my pages on Facebook being shut down. I had one page about World War II, for example, where I talked about the true history of World War II. That page was shut down. The establishment does not want anyone to know that there is an alternative narrative of World War II, that perhaps the Allies weren't the white knights in shiny armor riding in to save the day that everyone thinks they are, that the court historians have conjured up this image in the history books that they write. History in quotation marks. It's not true history. And yet, I was kicked off of, I had that page deleted by Facebook for alleged hate speech violations. That's what they told me, hate speech. I told the truth, and that's called hate speech. And that's really what hate speech is these days. You said something that we didn't want you to say. Hate speech. I've had another of my Facebook pages, my page, Feminism is a Disease. I had that temporarily unpublished, again because of false accusations by some feminists who didn't like what I had to say. So instead of just disagreeing with me, instead of just leaving, instead of being polite and kind and respecting my right to say what I think is true, they turned into would-be tyrants, mini dictators, and complained about me. This is how life was during the Soviet era in Russia. Everyone snitched on everyone. You couldn't trust anyone, so no one talked to each other. It was a society of snitches. You never knew when the KGB would be listening in on your conversation. Just like today, the NSA, they are listening in on your conversation. America is the most spied on nation in world history. But that's a podcast for another time. Fortunately, in my case of my Feminism is a Disease page, someone on Facebook's end saw a little bit of sense and listened to my appeal, and the page was reinstated. Now I have 1,000 likes on that page, and it's going along in a really nice clip. I've Had other timeouts, though, given to me by Facebook. Uh, a 24-hour timeout, 3-day, and a 7-day. And then I've had other times where they told me, you can't share anything. You can't like, you can't do this. Oh, you're using this feature wrong. All those sorts of little things. Most frequently, it's because I find out someone complained about me because they don't like my speech. So instead of protecting that speech so that they themselves will be protected one day when they say something someone else doesn't like, they come after me. And this is what's happening in our society at large. So the whole notion of free speech is eroding. Today, it's if you don't follow the party line, the establishment narrative, then your speech can't be protected. You're a danger. You're going to upset the status quo. So that's what we're dealing with here. Now, in agreement with Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson said this, quote, "It behooves every man who values liberty of conscience for himself to resist invasions of it in the case of others." Close quote. Another time, Jefferson said this, "The rights of conscience we never submitted, we could not submit." He means to government. "We are answerable for them to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error." Close quote. We owe so much to this very uniquely American right. Of course, it's a human right that we have our liberty of conscience and that we can speak our mind. However, in most nations on earth, this right has been severely curtailed. In the United States Constitution, however, it is fundamental. It is one of the foundation stones for this American superstructure. James Madison, who is often called the father of the Constitution, he also agreed. He said, quote, "To the press alone, checkered as it is with abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression." Close quote. We really do owe so much to this right, to this ability to have reason, intellect, discussion, dialogue, flourish, rather than might makes right. This party's in power, so they determine what's true and not true. That's what banana republics down in Latin America, that's how they operate. That's how the Soviet Union operated. That's how Red China today operates. Some of you may have just seen the stories where a retired professor was hauled off the air during an interview he was given because he was being a little, shall we say, hostile to the communist regime in China. The follow-up to that story is he was just detained. He was placed on house arrest, and the last I saw, he had just been detained. See, that's how things operate in the rest of the world. That's how Red China operates. You say something the regime doesn't like, you could go to prison. Thank God our founding fathers placed in the Bill of Rights a provision that would protect us in our free speech. Unfortunately, however, that is going out the window because we've developed a Soviet mindset. That is, we've developed this party line mindset. You have to go along with the party line, period. If you're not going along with the party line, well, you need to be silenced because you're an enemy to the regime, to the status quo. And that's unfortunately where we're at these days. Now, one of the major assaults against free speech has come through so-called hate speech legislation and hate crimes. Now, I want to start by saying this is a completely bogus, unjust, and ridiculous category of law. There can't be hate crimes. There's only crimes. If you steal something, why does it matter why you stole it? If you murder someone, does it matter if you were racially motivated? If you were motivated out of hate? If you were motivated or for whatever reason? Does it matter? No, of course not. The act is what should be punished, not the motivation. And yet today we focus on the person's thought. Ron Paul, in his book Liberty Defined, 50 Essential Issues That Affect Our Freedom, he has a chapter on hate crimes. And he wrote something that's very, very poignant to our discussion here. He said, quote, "Passing legislation concerning crimes against minorities is supposed to show compassion and prove that our society does not discriminate. In fact, these laws do the opposite. Confidence that such efforts will help protect minorities causes a gross misunderstanding of individual rights. If all individuals should be treated the same under the law, then providing greater penalties to those who commit crimes against certain racial or sexual orientation groups nullifies this effort. It means that the law provides lesser penalties to those individuals committing crimes against people without that favored orientation." The fallacy of this type of legislation has led to the routine understanding of groups having rights rather than all individuals having equal rights. Too often, we hear reference to gay rights, minority rights, and women's rights, etc., which undermines the concept of individual liberty. The idea that a crime can be judged as to whether it was motivated by hate for certain groups introduces the notion of a thought police. If someone is robbed, beaten, or killed, the penalty should be unrelated to what the perpetrator was thinking at the time. It hardly matters. The actions are the actions. Imposing preferential penalties endorses the concept of relative rights, which is, of course, a very dangerous, slippery slope. It implies that some victims have greater worth than others. The extra and arbitrary enforcement power mocks the principle of equal justice before the law. Why should the penalty for assault be different depending on race, sexual orientation, or membership in a particular group? Close quote. Phenomenal statement. Trust me, we do not want to get to the point where rights are relative. Unfortunately, we're almost already there in some cases. But we don't want to get fully there where you're protected if you belong to a certain class and you're discriminated against by the law. For example, under hate crimes legislation, if you belong to a different class. For example, in Soviet Russia, if you belong to the bourgeois class, you're an enemy of the revolution. And it doesn't matter if you're the nicest person in the world. It doesn't matter if you've ever committed a crime or if you've been completely straight-laced. It doesn't matter if you believe in God or if you are a terrible atheist. It's completely irrelevant. It's class warfare. If you belong to the bourgeois class, well, you're an enemy. Also, if you belong to the proletariat, the so-called working class, which is actually led by elitists like Lenin, who never worked a day in his life. If you belong to that class, then you are protected. Again, notwithstanding your actions. You could be the worst monster in the world, but as long as you belong to that class and say the right things and follow the party line, you're okay. Can't you see that this is developing here in the United States? In places like California, with a K, the Republic of California, they already have this sort of mentality. It's cultural Marxism, folks. Now, Judge Andrew Napolitano, he talks about free speech a lot. In his book Constitutional Chaos, he wrote this about one of the groups that is assaulting free speech. He said, quote, "The First Amendment explicitly prohibits the government from interfering with free speech. The amendment is in danger, and its danger comes from the least likely of sources, the judiciary. Every school child can recite, quote, 'Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech,' unquote. But over the last few years, freedom of speech, the quintessential American liberty, has come under fire from several troubling rulings in which judges, the traditional defenders of individual liberties against the censoring potential of the government, have abused their authority to restrict the content of speech in a frightening manner. Close quote. He then proceeds to give quite a few examples of how freedom of speech is being eroded by the courts. Based on what? On their own personal agenda, not based on the law, because the law is very clear. The government shall make no law, right? It's a thou shalt not phrase. The Bill of Rights is really a list of thou shalt nots to the government. Thou shalt not infringe this right. Thou shalt not infringe that right. Thou shalt not make a law respecting religion. Thou shalt not take away our guns, and so on and so forth. Yet, these people in power, they have a different ideology. It's an alien, a foreign ideology. It's a Soviet ideology. They believe very strongly in cultural Marxism. They want to fundamentally transform, as President Obama, the Soviet mole, said. They want to transform fundamentally our entire nation, from culture to laws to policies. You name it, they want to transform it. And this brings us to what I think is the most important, or one of the most important, principles of this podcast. In order to effectively defend against an attack, we have to know who is attacking us. Well, in this case, there are a lot of culprits. There are many people who have been propagandized over the years, been indoctrinated. So this is their mindset from the time that they're 1 year old. They're having it beat into their brain that certain types of speech are off limits. You can't do it. You can't say these things. For example, you can't say the LGBT movement is an insidious, devilish movement designed to break down and destroy the traditional family and home and morals of this country. You can't say that women's liberation movement was a communist front movement, that feminism is a disease. You can't say those sorts of things. At least certain segments of our population have grown up believing that. You can't say that. You have to be tolerant, they say. Oh, so tolerant. Well, years and years ago, there's a man named Edward Bernays. Some of you may know him, some of you may not. He is considered the father of modern propaganda. In fact, he wrote a book titled Propaganda. In it, it's a really fascinating book. He gives a lot of examples of how we are manipulated without even knowing it by what he terms an invisible government. Before I get to that quote, let's see how he defines propaganda. He says, modern propaganda is a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group. Close quote. So in other words, it's a concerted effort, you could almost say a conspiracy, to persuade people to believe a certain way, or to relate to certain groups a certain way. The mainstream media, for example, as I noted, they want the American people to react a certain way to whites, to Christians, to constitutionalist conservatives, to males in general. Feminists preach that males are evil, that all males are rapists. That's been said so many times I can't even count. They want us to think that cops kill black people at high rates, when in fact that's not true. More whites are killed than blacks by police. That's just the plain statistics. They see the media, through their constant bombardment of propaganda and lies, they try to persuade us to believe a certain narrative. In this case, it's cultural Marxism. That's what's being pushed in every single particular. And it is this invisible group of little dictators, basically, who are the ones pulling the strings, who are the ones manipulating our minds. Bernays wrote this in his book, quote, "There are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. It is not generally realized to what extent the words and actions of our most influential public men are dictated by shrewd persons operating behind the scenes. Now, what is still more important, the extent to which our thoughts and habits are modified by authorities. In some departments of our daily life in which we imagine ourselves free agents, we are ruled by dictators exercising great power." Close quote. That's so true. We are ruled by dictators, these bureaucrats, these nameless, faceless bureaucrats that we never see, who sign all these regulations, who pass all these ridiculous statutes, and the people of the EPA, the FCC, all these groups that, and all these departments that are unconstitutional, that shouldn't exist in the first place. You have millions of people working for these groups, and they're going around exercising authority on the American people, though they have no authority. They've never been elected. They have no authority. And yet they're exercising it over us. They're telling us what we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot say, what we can and cannot think in some cases. So Bernays was right. There really is an invisible government, if you will. And that government is a communistic government. Political correctness is a way of life in our country anymore. Political correctness, though, has a very specific origin. Most people don't know what the origin is. Well, let me tell you what the origin is. The Encyclopedia Britannica, which is hardly a conspiratorial source, said this of political correctness, quote, "The term first appeared in Marxist-Leninist vocabulary following the Russian Revolution of 1917. At that time, it was used to describe adherence to the policies and principles of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that is, the party line." Close quote. That is what political correctness is, following the Communist Party line. If you want to just be blunt, that's what it is. It's cultural Marxism, through and through. Some people probably tire of me talking about communism. Well, sorry, I'm going to keep talking about it. Communism is the evilest of all the various conspiracies and seductive and subversive forces on Earth today. It's the most widespread, most powerful and prevalent of all of them. The more I look, the more I see how nearly every single thing that is tearing down our republic, that is making a muck of this world that we live in, that's deteriorating our currency, that is corrupting people's minds and perverting our culture, destroying our families, causing wars, comes back to the communists. It's uncanny. You look it up, you start peeling back the layers, you see that there are communist agents behind it almost every single time. Most all of the feminist leaders, for example, in this country were card-carrying members of the Communist Party. The man who founded the first gay society, the Mattachine Society, Henry Hayes, he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA in California. The environmentalist movement was kicked off on Lenin's would-be 100th birthday in 1970. At what we today know as Earth Day. Do you really think that's a coincidence? Terrorism. Most modern terrorists received their training in Soviet terrorist training camps. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Political correctness, these hate speech monstrosities, and all these other front movements and groups, they're Soviet. They're alien. They're foreign. They're designed to destroy and overthrow this nation. Now, one of my favorite books on the communist connection to political correctness, or the communist force behind it, is written by Kent Klitzbe, I'm not sure how you say his name, Clizbe. He wrote a book called Willing Accomplices: How KGB Covert Influence Agents Created Political Correctness, Obama's Hate America First Political Platform, and Destroyed America. In his book, he provides a lot of sources, a lot of details, a lot of good information. I'm just going to take one little paragraph from it. Page 54. He wrote, PC, or political correctness, was created as an attitude and point of view in the early 1920s. It was inserted into American culture by selected agents of influence. The agents of influence, whether witting of communist intelligence guidance or unwitting, were all willing accomplices in propagating the attitudes that became PC. And then it was later in the 1960s that these really gained traction during the counter-revolution, so-called. And the interesting thing about the counter-revolution is that, or the counterculture, I should say, counterculture. The interesting thing about the counterculture is that it is now the dominant culture. See, it didn't go away after the 60s and 70s. It became the culture. It won. Now, there's a man, I've quoted him before, Louis Francis Boudin's. He wrote a book called Men Without Faces. It's about the communist conspiracy in the USA. And he has firsthand knowledge of this conspiracy because he was in it. He worked hard for a decade to bring about radical change in this country. And his chief job was that of editor of the Daily Worker in New York, the communist magazine. And so his whole job was dealing with propaganda. This was with the issue of speech and with the issue of information. So here's what he said after he renounced his communist ties and spent the rest of his life publishing books against the communists. This is what he said, quote, "There is no greater tribute to the effectiveness of the Soviet fifth column in this country than the obvious fact that it has befogged the American mind regarding its ruthless resolve to wipe out American independence. Nothing is so clear-cut as its continual insistence within its own ranks that violent attack upon the government here is highly essential. But so skilled are its propagandists, disguised as non-communists in the radio, newspapers, and moving picture world, that they have made Americans believe every revelation of red espionage is the result of hysteria. They have done a fairly adequate job of making America ashamed of defending its own freedoms." Close quote. These disguised wolves in sheep's clothing, these communist Marxist agents of influence, they disguise themselves as radio talk show hosts. Sometimes they call themselves conservatives, sometimes liberals, sometimes Democrats, sometimes Republicans. Doesn't matter. As long they'll call themselves whatever they need to, progressives, neoconservatives, whatever, as long as it will gain them influence. And they use that influence then to slowly, gradually, seductively denigrate those freedoms that we've taken for granted for far too long. Those freedoms written down in and guaranteed to us by the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. One of the foremost among those is the right of free speech. We really are ashamed these days to defend that one, aren't we? Some of us do. But think of how often your average person out there refuses to share a political post on Facebook, for example, or make a political stand on Twitter or Tumblr, or post a controversial video on YouTube. It happens all the time. It happens every day. I see it all the time. People are afraid. They don't want their families to know what they really believe. They don't want their friends on Facebook to see them because they're afraid they'll all unlike their page or all unfriend them. You know, these sorts of fears have crept in, and it's directly because the culture has been taken over by these people who are not only ashamed of our freedoms, but they're antagonistic to them because they don't jive with what the current party line is. Now, most people, it must be admitted, don't know that they're doing this. They've been indoctrinated from birth. So they don't know that this is what they're doing. But it's what they're doing anyway. And so whether you knowingly or unknowingly help the conspiracy, you're still helping the conspiracy. J. Edgar Hoover, a great man who tried to warn America of this communist threat, he said this about communist front organizations, quote, "They represent transmission belts through which the Communist Party furthers its conspiratorial designs. They have infiltrated every conceivable sphere of activity: youth groups, radio, television, and motion picture industries, church, school, education and cultural groups, the press, nationality minority groups, and civil and political units." Close quote. There literally is no aspect of American life that these agents of influence, often many of them foreigners, or guided by foreigners directly, have not infiltrated. They've infiltrated every single thing you can imagine. I rattled off a list earlier. Feminism, the LGBT movement, environmentalist movement, all these movements and isms. ACLU, Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist. Rosa Parks, she was a communist. If you didn't know. You can go down a list of these so-called icons and these so-called heroes that we hold up. Well, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Those people who are held up as heroes, they're not heroes. See, our press is controlled by the enemy. So are they going to hold up a true hero? Someone who is a true American, defending true American values? No, of course not. They're going to hold up someone like a Barack Obama, or in the foreign press, someone like a Nelson Mandela, or a Gorbachev. They're going to hold these people up as these wonderful icons of peace and these freedom fighters, when in fact someone like a Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. He was actually sent to prison for terrorism. His wife is a murderer, on record, convicted. So these sorts of people that are held up as our heroes and icons, people that we should emulate, we shouldn't emulate them. See, people who really try to stand up against this tide of cultural Marxism, they're shot down and their characters assassinated. Ezra Taft Benson, you've heard me quote him before on these podcasts, and I will quote him many, many, many a time in the future. He raised perhaps the longest and loudest voice against the communist conspiracy that's ever been raised in this country. And so I'm going to quote a few different statements that he made. Now, in referring to communist front groups, he said, "Of course, such groups can have only one purpose, and that is deception. The only way to avoid being deceived is to get the facts." He said, "Here are people who would try to hide the facts from us and replace the truth with a falsehood. They want us to believe that America is a failure, that her system of capitalistic free enterprise is doomed, that she must remedy her failures by adopting Marxist theories of collectivized control." Close quote. And he went on and talked about how he's had many people, when he was in Washington, as Secretary of Agriculture, and elsewhere, come to him and tell him, we need to adopt this principle or this program, that were ultimately Marxist programs. And he said this, quote, "None of them came to me in the name of communism or even socialism, but they came." Close quote. So though they don't use the communist label, if you peel off the wrapper, what's inside? It's communism. The United States has adopted all 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. That is a fact. Look it up. All 10 of them. We now have a national bank, the Federal Reserve. We have free education, free public schooling. All these various planks, the assaults on private property, etc., they're all here. They're all happening. One of the few things we have left on our side is the ability to verbalize our opposition to these things. And so now they're assaulting that, trying to belittle us and humiliate us and smear us and to cow us into surrendering our own freedom of speech into self-silencing. Ezra Benson said during his day, quote, "It is the current anti-communism drive and the branding as super patriots, fanatics, and right-wing extremists, those who defend the freedom, traditions, and principles on which this great nation was founded. The implication is to make of them something that is evil." Close quote. We see this in our press all the time. Those who stand up for American values, Americanism, this unique heritage of American liberty that we have, they're called conspiracy theorists. They're associated with the KKK. They're called white supremacists, anti-Semites, fascists, Nazis, racists, bigots, homophobes, prudes. The list goes on and on and on. They have this list of insults. It's just like a set list that they can go off of. It's this script. They can't help themselves. They have to stick to this ludicrous script. They call everyone by these names. You don't agree with them? You're a racist. You support traditional marriage? Oh, you're a homophobe. You actually want your wife to stay at home with your kids? Oh, you oppressor, you patriarchal pig. And it goes on and on and on. As Jack Benson talked about this, he said, quote, "The smear seems to be the most widely used and effective tool of the conspiracy to discredit and weaken any effective anti-communist effort. The smear of any individual or organization by the communists, their dupes and fellow travelers, is certain evidence of effectiveness. If any of you are affiliated with patriotic organizations reportedly opposed to the communist conspiracy, which are not extensively smeared, you can rest assured your opposition is largely ineffective. You had best look for a more fruitful affiliation." Close quote. And I believe that wholeheartedly. In my own life, that's been true. When I say those things that are controversial, I have opposition. I've been called every name in the book. I've had my own person threatened by feminists. I've had people say they wish they wish that I'd be divorced. They've said all sorts of horrible things. Denigrated my parents, my religion. I've been called a racist, a homophobe, misogynist, a bigot, a Nazi, anti-Semite. If I had more time, I could probably list a whole bunch more. I've been sworn at. Every vile thing you could think of have been said to me. And so I take that as a sign that, hey, I'm hitting a nerve here. I'm onto the truth. Officer Doug Trouble, Traubel, he wrote a book called Red Badge, a veteran peace officer's commentary on the Marxist subversion of American law enforcement and culture. He's a retired peace officer. He has a section in his book about hate crimes and so-called hate speech. He connects this mainly to race relations in this country, but he has some good principles here. The first thing he does is quote Voltaire, who famously said, "To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize." See, it's funny. I often see people in the LGBT community, the feminists, minorities, saying, "We need to make our voice heard. Let's stand up, make our voice heard." That's baffling to me. See, their voice is the only voice that is heard. Their voice and their perspective and their principles, their lifestyle, their worldview, that's the only thing we hear from the mainstream media. Be it CNN or Fox News, that's the only thing we hear. This cultural Marxist garbage. What you don't hear are voices like Alex Jones, who's being shut down. You don't hear people like Chuck Baldwin, Pastor Chuck Baldwin up in Montana. You don't hear Ron Paul. He's not invited very often on these shows. So you don't hear these sorts of conservative, constitutionalist voices speaking out against this tyranny we're seeing and speaking out for traditional values, Christianity, morality. traditional marriage. See, our voice is the one that is being silenced. Now, Officer Trouble, he says here in his book, quote, hate crimes are another category of tailor-made law. They are the absolute manifestation of Orwellian thought crimes. If you are a civilian or public official and argue against hate crime legislation, you are cast as a racist. Hate crime laws have never been about suppressing crime or protecting minorities. If legislatures wanted to impact crime, they would address the prolific black-on-black and black-on-white crime that has plagued society for decades. Hate crime laws actually contribute to rampant crime because out of fear of being snared themselves by a biased and racially charged Justice Department, police make fewer self-initiated proactive contacts with blacks and other minorities, leaving communities less safe. He goes on and says, from a strict legal analysis, hate crimes are not crimes at all. They should be nullified by jurors. Hate crime laws, in quotes, laws, are invalid because they cannot stand on their own. They must be subjectively affixed to a host crime. He says, goes on, and says, when someone says you offend them, what they are really saying is that you must agree with them. And so it is with the state. Codifying dissent as a crime by using subjectively charged hate crime laws is dangerous to liberty. Government should punish harmful acts, not ugly or dissenting thoughts and opinions. Close quote. And that's really the crux of the matter right there. It's that when people say you offended them, when you violated their little safe space, what they're really saying is that you disagreed with them, and they can't stand that. They can't stand that you have gone against the party line. You're not in full agreement with this cultural Marxist trash that's being shoved down our throats by the media day in and day out. And they can't stand it. They just can't stand it. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to stand up. We need to exercise our rights. If we don't use them, we'll lose them. If we're not actively using our free speech to defend free speech, we'll eventually be shut down and silenced. And if we're not using that free speech to defend the speech of others that we don't agree with who are being attacked, we're also going to eventually lose ours, because that precedent that we set will come back to bite us. We must remember what I quoted near the beginning today from Thomas Paine. Quote, he that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression. For if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself. Close quote. So I encourage you, especially if you are of like mind and that you believe in constitutional government, if you believe in old American values, if you believe in traditional family values, if you're a Christian, if you believe morality is essential to a republic, as our early founding fathers said over and over again, if you believe in the principle of rule of law, namely that we shouldn't listen to the loudest voice, that's irrelevant. That does not matter. We're not a democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government imaginable. A pure democracy is just pure evil. It's anarchy. It's mobocracy. There are no rights that are protected in a democracy. So if you believe, as I do, that we should have instead rule of law, where it doesn't matter what everyone else thinks, what matters is your right, then please make that view known. Don't be scared. Don't be scared that one of your friends might unfriend you on Facebook. Don't be scared that someone might call you a racist or a anti-Semite. Why should you be scared of that? Time is always on the side of truth. Yes, you will be persecuted. You should expect that. Thomas Jefferson once said, quote, politics, like religion, hold up the torches of martyrdom to the reformers of error. Politics, like religion, hold up the torches of martyrdom to the reformers of error. Close quote. So we should expect that people will be offended when we say the Communist Party line is not what I will follow. This is America, not the Soviet states of America. This is the United States of America. We must unite around our rights, our God-given rights, these natural rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. Free speech is absolutely essential, because without that, without the ability to protest other violations, what do we have left? In that case, all we have are our guns. And taking up those guns should be the last resort. Instead, while we still have some semblance of free speech left, let's use it and do what we can to turn back this Soviet tidal wave of propaganda and political correctness. Let us do what John Adams recommended. One of my favorite quotes. He said, quote, "Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write." Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. If we're not reading, thinking, speaking, and writing, what are we doing? Think about that. If we're not doing these things, if we're not studying and learning and reading, if we're not thinking deeply about the issues, if we're not speaking up and letting our voices be heard, and if we're not writing these things down, either to ourselves or to our families, what are we good for? What are we contributing? Our republic is crumbling, ladies and gentlemen. It needs us. America needs our help. Those of us who have any sort of sanity left, who have not gone over to the Reds, we're in the minority. We're no longer the majority. The culture has turned against us. However, it doesn't matter if you have a majority. Samuel Adams said, paraphrasing, it takes a tireless minority, keen on starting brush fires in the mind of men, to win. That's what it takes. It takes people who actually stand up, actually be bold enough to open their mouth, exercise their right, and stand firm on a principle. Do not bow to the party line. The party line these days is a Marxist line. It is a foreign, enemy, alien, hostile line. It is full of lies and is full of hate and proposed violence against you and me and anyone who believes in traditional values. If we allow them to take over the culture, if we allow them, this invisible government, to dictate what we can and cannot say, we're lost. If we are fine with Alex Jones and InfoWars being shut down just because we disagree with what they say, we're no better than the Soviets. And if we allow this to happen, then we set a precedent that will come back to bite us in the end. So I urge you, stand up, do what's right, and remember what Ezra Taft Benson once said, a true American cannot have too much patriotism. So be a true patriot, stand up for what's right, not what's expedient, and help us preserve our freedoms. So this is Zach Strong signing off for Liberty Wolf. Join me next time. Sic Semper Tyrannis. Long live liberty.